The city below was a river of light, a swirling, endless current of gold and white, but from the 42nd floor, it was utterly silent. Inside, the silence was just as deep, broken only by the quiet tick of a clock worth more than most cars. This was the world of Leo, a man who had climbed so high he'd forgotten what the ground felt like. His penthouse was a masterpiece of cold modern beauty, all sharp angles, polished steel, and vast windows that showed off the dazzling city like a painting. But it was a painting he never really saw anymore. The rooms were huge, empty, and echoed with a quiet he didn't know how to fill. He had everything a person could possibly want to buy, and yet he owned nothing that made him feel anything at all. His friends were business partners. His dinners were meetings. His life was a series of checked boxes on a very expensive list. Tonight, the list said, acquire art. His interior designer, a woman who spoke in hushed, important tones, had insisted the new north wall needed a statement piece, something with soul. Leo had almost laughed. Soul. What did a wall know about soul? But he'd agreed because it was something to do, a reason to put on the tailored black suit and step out into the noise he was so good at ignoring. The gallery was a different kind of quiet, a hushed, respectful one filled with the soft rustle of expensive clothing and the clink of champagne glasses. Leo moved through the crowd with an easy grace, a faint, polite smile on his face that never quite reached his eyes. He acknowledged other wealthy faces with a slight nod, exchanged a few meaningless words about market trends and summer homes, all the while his gaze drifting over the art on the walls. There were splashes of color, abstract shapes, and dramatic landscapes, but none of them stirred anything inside him. They were just objects. More things. He was beginning to feel the familiar weight of disappointment, the sense that once again, the world had nothing new to show him, when he turned a corner into a smaller, less crowded room. And there he stopped. His breath caught in his throat just for a second. It wasn't a large painting, but it commanded the entire wall. It was a sky, but not a peaceful one. It was a turbulent, passionate explosion of color. Dark, bruised purples and deep blues swirled together like a stormy sea, but ripped through the center of it all was a brilliant, defiant slash of gold, the color of sunlight fighting its way through the darkest clouds. It wasn't pretty. It was powerful. It was violent and beautiful all at once. For the first time in years, Leo was looking at something that wasn't just an object. He was feeling something. A deep, resonant ache, a recognition of a storm he felt inside his own chest. He stood there, frozen, the noise of the gallery fading into a dull hum, completely captivated by the battle of light and dark on the canvas. It was only after a long minute that he noticed the woman standing slightly to the side of the painting. She wasn't looking at the crowd. Her eyes were fixed on her own work, a soft, almost worried crease between her brows. She was beautiful, but in a way that was completely different from the polished people surrounding her. Her hair was the color of rich honey, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She wore a simple dark blue dress, and she was nervously twisting a silver ring on her finger. This, he realized, must be the artist. The gallery owner, a sleek man in a sharp suit, materialized at Leo's elbow. Ah, Mr. Thorne. I see you found Aurora's piece. Resurgence, it's called. Quite raw, isn't it? She's one of our newer talents. The man's voice was a low, unctuous whisper. Aurora dear, he called, beckoning her over. This is Mr. Leo Thorne. She turned, and her eyes, the color of the summer sky at twilight, met his. There was a flicker of surprise in them and then a deep, captivating warmth. She offered a small, shy smile. Hello, she said, and her voice was softer than he expected, like music. Up close, he could see a tiny smudge of gold paint on her wrist, a secret signature of her work. Leo, who was never at a loss for words, found himself strangely tongue-tied. He simply pointed at the painting, the one that had silenced the noise in his head. This, he said, his voice lower than usual. This is incredible. Aurora's cheeks flushed a delicate pink. Thank you, she murmured, her gaze dropping for a moment before returning to his. It was a personal piece. He didn't ask what it meant. He felt like he already knew. He understood the storm. He understood the fight for the light. I'll take it, Leo said, the words coming out more abruptly than he intended. The gallery owner beamed. Aurora's eyes widened in shock. Really? She breathed. Just like that. Leo nodded, finally finding his footing. Just like that. It doesn't belong here. It belongs somewhere it can be seen. He meant his empty penthouse, but as he looked at her, he felt a strange sense that he was talking about something else entirely. The business was quickly settled. Leo wrote a check that made the gallery owner's smile stretch even wider. As he was about to turn away to retreat back into his shell, he stopped and looked at Aurora again. She was watching him, that same curious, warm expression in her eyes. He pulled a simple, elegant business card from his pocket. "For the delivery details," he explained, handing it to her. Their fingers brushed and a simple electric jolt passed between them. It was so sudden, so real, that Aurora's breath hitched and Leo's heart gave a single hard thump against his ribs. The air around them seemed to crackle and grow warm. For a long moment they just looked at each other, the noise and the people around them melting into a blur. The storm in the painting, it seemed, was just the beginning. The days following the art show seemed to pass with a strange, new quality for Leo. The city outside his windows was the same, the meetings in his glass-walled office were the same, but the silence in his penthouse felt different. It was no longer just an empty space, it was a space waiting to be filled. The blank wall where Aurora's painting, Resurgence, was soon to hang seemed to accuse him of his own solitude. He found his mind drifting at the most inopportune times, during board summaries and financial forecasts, not to numbers or strategies, but to a pair of summer sky eyes and a tiny, defiant smudge of gold paint on a delicate wrist. The memory of that electric shock when their hands touched was a persistent echo in his mind, a sensation so vivid and unfamiliar it was almost disorienting. He was a man who dealt in tangibles, in assets and acquisitions, yet he was now preoccupied with a feeling, a ghost of a connection that had lasted only a few moments. He told himself his interest was professional, that he was a patron of the arts, that he simply wanted to ensure the safe delivery of his new acquisition. But the truth, a truth he was reluctant to fully admit even to himself, was that he wanted to hear her voice again. He wanted to see if the warmth he had seen in her gaze was real, or just a trick of the gallery's curated lighting. It was this internal debate that led him, 3 days later, to pick up his private phone, the one with a number very few people possessed. He held Aurora's simple business card, the paper feeling flimsy and insignificant in his hand, yet it felt heavier than any contract. He dialed the number, the clicks of the digits sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet of his study. The phone rang once, twice, and then her voice was there, a soft, slightly breathless, "Hello?" It was the same musical quality he remembered, and he felt a completely irrational sense of relief. He introduced himself, his own name feeling formal and clumsy on his tongue. Leo Thorne. There was a slight pause on the other end, a heartbeat of silence where he feared she had already forgotten him, but then her response was warm, laced with a hint of pleasant surprise. "The man who buys storms," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. The phrase struck him. It was so perfectly, uniquely her. He cleared his throat, sticking to his prepared, professional script. He inquired about the painting's delivery timeline, but then, before he could lose his nerve, he veered sharply from the script. He asked her if she would be willing to discuss the possibility of a commission, a companion piece for the painting, over dinner. He emphasized it would be a business dinner, a quiet place where they could talk without the noise of a gallery. On the other end of the line, in a small sunlit studio apartment cluttered with canvases, tubes of paint and the faint, familiar scent of turpentine, Aurora felt her heart do a funny little flip. She was standing amidst her own chaotic world, wearing an old paint-stained shirt, and the voice of Leo Thorne, a man who existed in a universe of penthouses and private galleries, felt like a transmission from another planet. Her first instinct was a flutter of panic. A dinner? With him? She thought of the careful, controlled way she had to live her life, the secret she carried with her every single day like a hidden weight. The world of fancy restaurants and business discussions was not her world. It was a world of potential complications, of questions she wasn't ready to answer. But then she thought of his eyes in the gallery, the way he had looked at her painting not with cold appraisal, but with a deep, almost pained understanding. He hadn't just seen the colors, he had seen the storm. And he had looked at her with a genuine curiosity that had made her feel seen, not just as an artist but as a person. The fear and the longing warred within her for a long moment. Finally, the part of her that was tired of being careful, the part that had painted Resurgence, won out. She agreed, her voice only trembling slightly. The restaurant he chose was predictably exquisite. It was a place of low, intimate lighting, of white tablecloths so crisp they seemed to glow, and a hushed, reverent atmosphere where the clink of silverware was the loudest sound. Aurora felt a fresh wave of nerves as she was led to a secluded booth in the back. She had worn her best dress, a simple emerald green one that brought out the gold in her hair, but she still felt like an imposter, a sparrow who had accidentally flown into an aviary of peacocks. Then she saw him. Leo was already there, standing as she approached. He wasn't in a suit this time but in a dark, soft-looking sweater and trousers, and the change made him seem somehow more approachable, more real. His smile when he saw her was not the polite, practiced one from the gallery, it was slower, more genuine, and it reached his eyes, making them crinkle at the corners. "Aurora," he said, and the way he said her name like it was something precious, sent a shiver down her spine. The initial conversation was stilted, orbiting the safe topics of the painting's upcoming delivery and the general process of her art. Leo ordered for them both, choosing a meal he thought she would like with a quiet confidence that was reassuring, not arrogant. As the food arrived, something began to shift. He started asking her different questions. Not about technique or inspiration but about her. He asked what she loved about the city, what music she listened to while she painted, what her first memory of wanting to create was. He listened to her answers with an intensity that was almost unnerving, his full attention focused on her as if every word she said was of vital importance. Encouraged by his genuine interest, Aurora began to relax. The words started to come more easily. She found herself talking about things she hadn't spoken of in years. Her childhood spent chasing fireflies in a backyard that seemed enormous, the first time she'd mixed two colors and created a completely new one, the simple, profound joy of getting a line or a shape exactly right. She made him laugh with a story about a disastrous attempt to paint a mural on her childhood bedroom wall that had ended with more paint on the family dog than on the wall. It was a real, warm, unguarded laugh, and the sound of it transformed his entire face, making him look younger, lighter. Leo in turn found himself speaking in ways he never did. He told her about the first business he'd started in his college dorm room, not for the money but for the thrill of the puzzle of making something work. He confessed that he missed that feeling sometimes, the pure creation of it, before it all became about profit margins and market share. He talked about his love for old, worn-out books with cracked spines, a secret passion he rarely admitted to anyone in his circle who valued only the new and the sleek. They weren't exchanging resumes or life summaries. They were exchanging pieces of themselves, little fragments of memory and feeling, and with each exchange the space between them seemed to shrink, charged with a growing, magnetic pull. The restaurant, the other patrons, the world outside, all of it faded into a distant blur. For those few hours, there was only the soft glow of the candle on the table, the warmth of the wine, and the incredible, unfolding discovery of each other. It was the most connected Leo had felt to another human being in a decade. For Aurora, it was the first time in a very long time that she had felt truly normal, truly cherished for her mind and her spirit, and not defined by the silent burden she carried. The evening had to end. They stood outside the restaurant under a canopy of stars, the city air cool against their warmed skin. The comfortable intimacy of the booth was gone, replaced by the tense, sweet anticipation of a goodbye. "I had a really wonderful time, Aurora," Leo said, his voice low and sincere. He meant it with every fiber of his being. "So did I," she replied, her smile soft and a little dazed, as if she too couldn't quite believe the night had been real. He offered to call his driver for her, but she declined, saying she lived close and wanted to walk. It was as she took a step to leave that it happened. A sudden, sharp, twisting pain, familiar and dreaded, lanced through her lower abdomen. It was a pain she knew all too well, a cruel reminder that her body was not her own. She couldn't stop the faint gasp that escaped her lips, or the slight stumble in her step as her hand flew instinctively to her side. Her face, which had been glowing with happiness just a moment before, paled noticeably. Leo was at her side in an instant, his hand gently but firmly on her arm to steady her. His brow was furrowed with immediate concern. "Aurora? What is it? What's wrong?" The worry in his voice was so raw, so unprotected, that it undid her. The wall she had so carefully maintained all evening crumbled. The fear of his reaction warred with a desperate, overwhelming need for him to know the truth of her, the whole, unvarnished truth. She looked up at him, her summer sky eyes now clouded with pain and vulnerability. She took a shaky breath. "Leo," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "There's something I need to tell you. I have a sickness. It's something inside me that, it causes me a lot of pain sometimes. And on the bad days, it can make me bleed." She forced herself to hold his gaze, waiting for the flicker of pity, of disgust, or worse, the polite withdrawal she had seen so many times before. She was giving him her deepest, most fragile secret, and she was terrified it would be the last thing she ever gave him. The week that followed their dinner was a study in exquisite tension for Leo. The memory of Aurora's confession hung in the air of his penthouse, a fragile, precious thing he was afraid to shatter. He had replayed the moment in his mind 100 times, the way her brave facade had crumbled, the raw fear in her eyes as she handed him this intimate and painful truth about her body. His reaction, the simple act of holding her hand, had felt like the most important thing he had ever done. It wasn't pity he felt, it was a fierce, surprising surge of protectiveness. He found himself thinking not of the sickness, but of the immense courage it must have taken for her to live with it, to create such beauty while carrying such a private burden. He sent her flowers the next day, not a grand, ostentatious bouquet, but a simple, elegant arrangement of white orchids with a note that read only, "Thank you for telling me." Her response, a single text message, "Thank you for listening," had felt like a door once firmly locked, being eased open just a crack. The painting, Resurgence, was delivered and hung on the vast empty wall. The workmen had left, and Leo stood alone in the cavernous living room, staring at the tumultuous sky. It was different now. He no longer just saw a storm, he saw her storm. He saw the pain in the dark purples, the defiance in the slashes of gold, and the relentless, beautiful spirit in the overall composition. The painting was no longer just an acquisition, it was a piece of her, a testament to her resilience, and its presence in his sterile home felt both jarring and profoundly right. It was this feeling that compelled him to call her again, to push past the careful boundaries they had established. He invited her to see it, to see her work in its new home, under the guise of ensuring it was hung to her artistic satisfaction. What he really wanted was to see her again, to be near the source of the light that was beginning for the first time, to penetrate the deep, settled cold within him. Aurora's arrival at his building was an event in itself. The sleek, silent elevator that soared to the penthouse, the hushed, marble-lined hallway, it was a world of unimaginable wealth that felt alien and intimidating. But when Leo opened the door, the look on his face was not one of pride or ownership, but of something closer to nervous anticipation. He was dressed casually again, and his eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Then he stepped aside and she saw it. Her painting, her storm, hanging in this temple of modern minimalism. It looked more powerful here, more defiant and alive than it ever had in the gallery. The sight of it, of her private struggle displayed so publicly yet so perfectly understood in this private space, brought a sudden, unexpected sting of tears to her eyes. "It belongs here," she whispered, and she wasn't just talking about the art. He gave her a tour, but it was perfunctory. The conversation was light, filled with unspoken things. He asked about her day, she asked about his work, but the air between them was thick with a charge that had been building since their hands first touched in the gallery. Every casual brush of his arm against hers as they walked sent a jolt through her system. Every time he looked at her, she felt seen in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. They ended up back in the living room, standing before the painting as the sun began to set, painting the real sky outside the window in hues of orange and pink that competed with the violent beauty on the wall. The city below began to sparkle to life, a mirror of the stars beginning to appear above. A comfortable silence fell between them, but it was a silence brimming with potential. He suggested a movie, something to break the tension, and she agreed. He dimmed the lights, and the vast room was illuminated only by the massive screen and the glittering cityscape beyond the glass. They sat on the large, soft sofa, a respectful distance between them at first. The movie, a romantic comedy, played on, but neither of them was watching. Aurora was acutely aware of every breath he took, of the scent of his cologne, clean and spicy. Leo was watching her from the corner of his eye, the way the flickering light from the screen played across her profile, highlighting the gentle curve of her neck, the soft fullness of her lips. The desire to touch her, to close the small, vast distance between them, was a physical ache in his chest. It was a feeling so long forgotten, so thoroughly buried under years of transactional relationships, that its return was almost overwhelming. It was Aurora who moved first. She shifted slightly, turning towards him, her eyes meeting his in the semi-darkness. In their depths, he saw no fear, no hesitation, only a reflection of his own consuming want. That was all the permission he needed. He reached out, his hand moving slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. His fingers gently brushed a stray strand of honey-colored hair from her cheek, tucking it behind her ear. The touch was feather-light, but it sent a tremor through both of them. Her eyes fluttered closed for a brief second. He leaned in, his movements deliberate and slow, his gaze locked on hers, asking a silent question. Her answer was a soft, almost imperceptible nod, and a sigh that escaped her parted lips. The first kiss was not rushed or frantic. It was a discovery. It was soft and searching, a tender exploration that held the weight of all their unspoken conversations, their shared understanding, their burgeoning connection. It tasted of wine and vulnerability and a hope so bright it was almost painful. When they finally broke apart they were both breathless. But it was only a beginning. The careful restraint they had both maintained shattered in that instant. The second kiss was deeper, more insistent, fueled by a hunger that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. His hands came up to cradle her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks as his mouth moved over hers with a passionate intensity that stole the air from her lungs. Her hands found their way into his hair, pulling him closer, her body arching into his. There were no more words. The movie was forgotten, the city outside was forgotten. There was only the dimly lit room, the soft fabric of the sofa beneath them, and the overwhelming, urgent need to be as close as two people could possibly be. Clothes were shed not with awkward fumbling, but with a reverent, desperate haste, each new inch of revealed skin a revelation. He was all hard planes and coiled strength, and she was softness and gentle curves. When he finally entered her, a single, smooth joining that made them both cry out, it felt less like a first time and more like a homecoming. It was a claiming and a surrender all at once. The world narrowed to the space of that sofa, to the feel of his skin against hers, the sound of their ragged breaths mingling, the sight of her face, flushed with pleasure and wonder, etched into his memory forever. The night that unfolded was one of lost count and timeless passion. They made love a second time on the sofa, slower now, more explorative, learning the rhythms and responses of each other's bodies. Then a third time later, in the soft glow of the bedside lamp in his bedroom, where he worshipped every inch of her with his hands and his mouth, learning the landscape of her, committing the feel of her to memory. A fourth time in the early hours of the morning, half asleep and driven by a dreamlike need to confirm the other was still there. A fifth time as the first gray light of dawn touched the sky, a lazy, languid coupling that was more about connection than climax. A sixth time was a quick, breathless encounter against the cool glass of the window, the sleeping city sprawled out beneath them, a silent witness to their passion. And finally, a seventh time as the sun properly rose, casting long golden beams across the rumpled sheets. This last time was tender, almost heartbreakingly sweet, a slow, deep, quiet union that seemed to seal a promise neither of them had yet spoken aloud. It was a night of sevenfold discovery, a physical conversation that spoke of longing, acceptance, and a desperate, shared hope. For Aurora, it was the first time she had given herself so completely, without reservation or the shadow of her illness dimming the moment. For Leo, it was the first time he had taken a woman to his bed and not felt alone afterwards. As they finally collapsed, spent and entangled in each other's arms, the world outside began to wake up. But for them, in the quiet of his bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of their passionate night, it felt as if they had created a universe of their own, a perfect private world built on touch, taste, and the terrifying, wonderful beginnings of love. The first rays of the sun were not gentle that morning, they were insistent. A blade of brilliant, unforgiving gold sliced through the gap in the blackout curtains, cutting across the rumpled landscape of the bed and landing directly on Leo's closed eyelids. He stirred, not with the groggy reluctance of most mornings, but with a swift, surging tide of consciousness. The memories of the night flooded back into him not as discrete images, but as a single, overwhelming sensation. A warmth, a weight, a profound sense of rightness that was so alien to him it felt like waking up on a new planet. The scent of Aurora's skin, a mix of vanilla and something uniquely her, still clung to his sheets, to his own skin. It was the most wonderful fragrance he had ever known. He kept his eyes closed for one more perfect moment, savoring the feel of her body curled against his side, her head a comforting weight on his chest, her honey-colored hair spilling across his skin like silk. Her breathing was deep and even, the slow, steady rhythm of untroubled sleep. A feeling of such powerful, unadulterated joy swelled within him that it was almost painful. He had spent a lifetime building walls, amassing a fortune to insulate himself from need, and in one night, this one woman had quietly dismantled them all. He felt for the first time truly rich. Slowly, carefully, so as not to disturb her, he turned his head on the pillow. The sunlight was stronger now, illuminating her sleeping face in exquisite detail. He could see the faint dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose, the dark sweep of her lashes against her cheeks, the soft, parted bow of her lips. She looked peaceful. She looked like everything he had never known he was searching for. His gaze was one of pure, unguarded wonder, a silent worship of the woman who had, in a handful of hours, rewritten the entire definition of his happiness. He wanted to remember this exact moment forever, the quiet, the warmth, the absolute perfection of her beside him. His eyes, full of a tenderness that would have shocked anyone who knew him only in a boardroom, began to drift from her face, wanting to take in all of her, to commit every detail of this scene to memory. They traveled over the smooth line of her shoulder, the elegant curve of her arm draped across his stomach, down to the gentle dip of her waist and the swell of her hip beneath the white sheet. And then he saw it. A small, stark, unmistakable patch of crimson on the pristine white linen. It was no bigger than a coin, but to Leo in that moment, it might as well have been a vast spreading sea of red. The sight was so jarring, so violently out of place in his cocoon of newfound bliss, that his entire body went rigid. The soft, adoring expression on his face vanished, wiped away in an instant and replaced by a blank, frozen mask. His breath hitched in his throat and stopped. His mind, usually a whirlwind of calculations and strategies, went utterly, terrifyingly silent. It was not a thought process that took over, but a primal, visceral reaction. The blood was not an abstract concept. It was a brutal, physical reminder of the secret she had entrusted to him on the street corner. It was the tangible evidence of her pain, her sickness, her vulnerability. The joy he had felt just seconds before curdled into a cold, sharp fear that lanced through him with the force of a physical blow. This was real. Her pain was real. The threat to this fragile, beautiful thing they had just created was real. He wasn't disgusted. He wasn't repulsed. He was terrified. The sight of that small stain made the entire world feel fragile, made her feel fragile, and the thought of anything harming her, of losing this feeling he had just found, was so paralyzingly awful that his brain simply short-circuited. He froze, his eyes locked on the red stain, his body as still as stone. Aurora stirred. The change in him was so profound it permeated her sleep. The warm, relaxed muscle of his chest beneath her cheek had turned to unyielding granite. The comforting rhythm of his breathing had stopped. She murmured something soft and sleepy, her eyes fluttering open. The first thing she saw was the city skyline, bathed in golden morning light. A slow, contented smile began to form on her lips as the memories of the night washed over her. She felt cherished. She felt whole. She turned her head on his chest to look up at him, to share a sleepy, intimate smile, and the smile died before it could fully bloom. She saw his face. She saw the frozen, distant look in his eyes, the complete lack of recognition in them. He was looking right past her, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beside her. Confused, she followed his line of sight. And her own heart stopped. There, on the sheet, was the evidence of her body's betrayal. The small, familiar stain that had caused her so much shame and fear for years. In the warmth and passion of the night, in the sheer, unadulterated joy of being with him, she had forgotten. She had let herself believe, for one perfect night, that she was just a woman, and he was just a man. The sight of the blood, and his frozen, horrified reaction to it, was a splash of ice water, a brutal return to a reality she could never escape. The silence in the room was no longer comfortable. It was heavy, suffocating, screaming with unspoken horror. She watched as he finally, slowly, dragged his gaze from the stain to her face. But the look in his eyes wasn't the tender, protective one from the restaurant. It was the stunned, shocked look of a man who had seen something he could not unsee. In that elongated, agonizing second, her mind, sharpened by years of anticipating rejection, interpreted his fear as disgust. His paralysis felt like a verdict. The most beautiful night of her life was now being viewed through the lens of her greatest insecurity. The fragile castle of hope and belonging she had built in her heart over the past weeks, a castle that had felt so strong and real just moments ago, crumbled into dust. A sound escaped her, a small, wounded whimper that was barely audible. It was the sound of her heart breaking. She jerked away from him, scrambling back on the bed, pulling the sheet with her to cover herself, her movements frantic with a fresh, searing pain that dwarfed any physical ache her sickness had ever caused her. The tears came then, not soft or slow, but in a hot, immediate flood, streaming down her face as she stared at him. "You," she choked out, her voice thick with a grief so profound it seemed to shake the room. "You can't even look at me." She saw the confusion in his eyes, the beginning of a protest forming on his lips, but she was beyond hearing it. Her worst fear had been realized in the most intimate way possible. "I knew it," she sobbed, the words tearing from her throat. "I knew you couldn't stand to see the real me." And with that, she launched herself from the bed, snatching her discarded clothes from the floor, her body shaking with violent, silent sobs. She didn't look back. She fled the bedroom, the penthouse, and the shattered pieces of their perfect night, leaving Leo alone, still frozen, the ghost of her warmth on his skin and the devastating echo of her words hanging in the silent, sunlit air. The slam of the heavy penthouse door was not a loud sound, not in a space so vast and so well insulated, but to Leo it was a gunshot. It shattered the frozen paralysis that had held him captive. The echo seemed to hang in the air for a long moment, and then the silence that rushed in to fill the space was of a different, more terrible quality. It was the silence of absence. The warmth was gone. The scent of her was already beginning to fade, replaced by the sterile, recycled air of the climate control system. He was alone again, but the solitude he had once worn like a familiar coat now felt like a suffocating vacuum. He looked down at the empty space beside him in the vast bed, at the indentation her head had left on the pillow, and the small, stark stain on the sheet that had started it all. It was only then that his body unlocked. A violent tremor ran through him, and he swung his legs over the side of the bed, burying his face in his hands. The memory of her face, the raw, shattered hurt in her eyes, played behind his closed eyelids like a devastating film on a loop. "I knew you couldn't stand to see the real me." The words were a brand searing his soul. He had not been disgusted. He had been terrified. But in his frozen, stupid silence, he had allowed her to believe the one thing that was farthest from the truth. He had confirmed her deepest fear. He moved through the penthouse like a ghost. The entire space was now a museum of their night together. The sofa where they had first kissed held the imprint of their bodies. A single, abandoned hairpin gleamed on the floor near the window where he had held her against the glass. The painting, Resurgence, seemed to mock him from the wall, its defiant gold slash a bitter reminder of the spirit he had just broken with his own inadequacy. He tried to call her. His first attempt, his fingers fumbling on the screen, went straight to voicemail. Her sweet, musical voice asking the caller to leave a message was a fresh agony. "Aurora, please," he said, his own voice rough with emotion. "It wasn't what you think. I froze because I was scared. Scared of your pain, scared of losing you. Please just call me back." He sent the same sentiment in a dozen frantic texts, each one pleading, explaining, begging for a chance to make her understand. The delivered receipts showed they were received, but there was no response. The little typing bubbles never appeared. The silence from her end was absolute, a wall more impenetrable than any he had ever faced in business. Across the city, in the safe, familiar clutter of her studio, Aurora was lost in a storm of her own. She had slammed her own door shut, locking the world out, and then she had collapsed against it, sliding to the floor as the sobs finally racked her body. They were not gentle tears. They were great, heaving waves of grief that tore from a place so deep inside her she didn't know it could feel pain. She cried for the beauty of the night, for the feeling of his hands on her skin, for the words he had whispered in the dark that she had almost allowed herself to believe. She cried for the hope that had blossomed so brightly and been extinguished so cruelly. And most of all, she cried because she had known. She had known it was too good to be true. She had known that her body, with its flaws and its betrayals, would eventually be the thing that drove him away. Seeing the blood and then seeing the look on his face, a look she had misinterpreted as revulsion, had felt like a fatal diagnosis. It was a confirmation that she was and always would be broken. Her phone buzzed and lit up on the floor beside her, his name flashing on the screen. The sound was like a physical blow. She couldn't answer. She couldn't hear his voice making polite, pitying excuses. Seeing his words pop up, "It wasn't what you think," felt like a cruel joke. Of course it was what she thought. She had seen it with her own eyes. She finally, with a trembling hand, reached over and turned the phone off completely, plunging herself into a deeper, more profound silence. The world could not get in and she had no desire to go out. For Leo, the days blurred into a miserable, gray procession. The penthouse became a prison. He canceled meetings, ignoring the increasingly concerned calls from his assistant. The world of mergers and acquisitions, of stocks and bonds, felt meaningless, a childish game compared to the real, raw pain of losing Aurora. He would stand for hours in front of her painting, staring into the storm, feeling like he was trapped inside of it. He replayed that morning moment over and over, hating himself for his reaction. He was a man who commanded boardrooms, who made billion-dollar decisions without breaking a sweat, and he had been rendered speechless and motionless by a tiny spot of blood. Not because it was blood, but because it was her blood, and it represented a part of her life he was powerless to fix. His fear of losing her had manifested in the exact way that guaranteed he would lose her. The irony was a bitter pill he could not swallow. For Aurora, the pain was a physical weight she carried with her. She tried to lose herself in her art, but the colors were muddy, the shapes lifeless. Every blank canvas seemed to reflect the emptiness she felt inside. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. She just moved through the small rooms of her apartment, a ghost in her own life, surrounded by the vibrant, passionate art she had created, a cruel reminder of a self that felt like it had died in Leo's bed that morning. Her sickness, the very thing she had feared would drive him away, flared up with a vengeance, a physical punishment to match her emotional torment. The pain was a constant, dull ache, a reminder that her body was her enemy. She felt utterly and completely alone, more alone than she had ever felt before she met him, because now she knew exactly what she was missing. Leo knew he could not go on like this. The texts and calls were useless. He had to see her. He had to look into her eyes and make her understand the truth that was screaming inside of him. He had to find a way to breach the wall of silence she had built around herself. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to try. The thought of a future without her, of returning to the cold, silent existence of before, was unbearable. He had been given a taste of sunlight, and he could not go back to the shadows. He had to find a way to tell her, to show her, that his freeze was not a rejection, but the terrified, clumsy reaction of a man who had just found everything he ever wanted and was instantly confronted with the possibility of its loss. He loved her. The realization, which should have been a joyful one, was a painful, desperate ache in his chest. He loved her, and he had to find a way to tell her before it was too late. The silence in Leo's penthouse had become a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating fog that filled the vast, empty spaces. For 3 days, he had been a prisoner within his own home, a ghost haunting the scenes of his own happiness. He had stopped calling, stopped texting. The silence from her end had been his answer, and it was a verdict of guilt he had no choice but to accept. But acceptance did not bring peace. It brought a gnawing, frantic energy that built inside him until he could no longer contain it. He stood before Resurgence, the painting that had started it all, and for the first time he did not see her storm. He saw his own. He saw the dark, swirling chaos of his regret, and the desperate, fading slash of gold that was his hope. He could not send another word. Words had failed him catastrophically. He had to show her. He had to find a language that was louder than his failed explanations, more honest than his frozen silence. He had to speak to the artist in her, to the part of her that understood color and shape and raw, unvarnished emotion. An idea, wild and unprecedented, began to form in his mind. It was foolish. It was desperate. It was utterly unlike anything the logical, controlled Leo Thorne had ever contemplated. And for those very reasons he knew it was the only thing left to do. He did not take his sleek, black car. He walked, the crisp city air doing nothing to clear the turmoil in his head. He went to a cramped, dusty art supply store, a world away from the pristine galleries he usually frequented. He stood, bewildered, before racks of tubes and cans of paint, surrounded by the pungent smells of turpentine and linseed oil. He, a man who could negotiate a corporate takeover in 3 languages, was rendered helpless by the simple question of what brushes to buy. He asked for help from a young, paint-smeared employee, mumbling something about a large project. He bought everything the young man suggested: cans of spray paint in a dozen vibrant colors, thick pots of acrylic brushes of various sizes, rolls of masking tape and large sheets of thick paper. He carried it all back to his building, ignoring the curious look from the doorman, and took it not to his penthouse, but down to the secure private parking garage. The blank, concrete wall at the back, usually reserved for notices and warnings, would be his canvas. He had no plan, no sketch. He simply started, driven by a need so profound it overrode a lifetime of careful planning. He began with a can of black spray paint, his hand trembling as he pressed the nozzle. The hissing sound was loud in the silent garage. He painted the dark, swirling purples and blues of her storm, not trying to copy her work, but to capture its feeling, the chaos, the pain, the isolation. It was messy. It was clumsy. The paint dripped in places. But he didn't stop. He switched to a brush in thick yellow paint, and with bold, unskilled strokes, he slashed a defiant gold line through the darkness just as she had. It was his apology. It was his understanding. Then he moved to the white space beside it. This part was harder. He had to paint not her feeling but his own. He painted a simple, stark outline of a man, his body language stiff, his face a mask of frozen shock. And next to that man, he painted a woman, her form turning away, a cascade of silver tears falling from her eyes that he created with drips of gray paint. This was his confession. This was the moment of his failure, rendered in brutal, honest simplicity. His hands were stained, his expensive clothes were ruined with splatters of color, but he worked with a single-minded focus he usually reserved for his most critical business deals. He was sweating, his muscles aching from the unfamiliar effort of holding brushes and spray cans for hours. The sun set outside and the garage lights flickered on, casting long, dramatic shadows across his work. He was exhausted, but he wasn't finished. Beneath the two figures, the man frozen and the woman crying, he took a final, clean brush and a pot of deep, blood-red paint. His hand was steady now. In large, clear, unmistakable letters, he wrote the words that held the entire truth of his heart. I was scared to lose you, not of you. He stood back, his chest heaving, and looked at the mural. It was raw. It was unrefined. It was the most honest thing he had ever created in his entire life. It was not a piece of art. It was a piece of his soul, ripped out and plastered on a concrete wall for her and only her to see. He didn't know when she would see it. He didn't even know if she would ever come this way again. He just knew he had to put it there, a permanent public testament to his private truth. He left the garage, the smell of fresh paint clinging to him, and went upstairs to wait. He didn't shower or change. He sat in the dark living room, staring at the city lights, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, hoping against hope that his message in a language of color and confession would find its way to her. It was the next morning. Aurora had left her apartment for the first time in days, driven by a desperate need for groceries and a futile attempt to re-engage with a world that felt colorless. She took a different route, avoiding the streets that reminded her of him. Her head was down, her shoulders slumped, a hollow ache settled deep in her chest. She was almost past his building when a splash of violent, familiar color on the concrete wall of the lower-level garage entrance caught her eye. It was a reflex, the artist in her noticing a composition. She slowed, her gaze drifting over the messy, powerful storm, the bold gold slash. Her breath caught. It was her style. It was her feeling. But it was rougher, more desperate. Her eyes traveled, taking in the two figures, the frozen man, the weeping woman, and the story they told was so painfully, intimately familiar it felt like a punch to the stomach. And then she saw the words. The red letters, the color of the stain that had broken them, spelled out a truth so simple, so profound, that it shattered the narrative of rejection she had built around her heart. I was scared to lose you, not of you. The world seemed to tilt. The noise of the city faded. She stood there, rooted to the spot, reading the words over and over. It wasn't disgust. It was fear. His fear. The same fear she carried. The wall she had built around her heart, brick by painful brick over the past days, crumbled into dust. The tears that came now were not of grief, but of an overwhelming, breathtaking release. She was still crying when a shadow fell over her. She didn't need to turn around. She could feel his presence. Slowly she turned. He was standing a few feet away, still in his paint-stained clothes, his face etched with exhaustion and a desperate, vulnerable hope she had never seen there before. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just looked at her, his eyes asking the same question his mural had asked. Leo, she whispered, her voice thick with tears. That single word, his name on her lips, broke the spell. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, closing the distance between them. Every word, he said, his voice rough with emotion, his gaze locked on hers. I was scared, Aurora. So terrified of that pain because it was a part of you, and the thought of anything hurting you, of losing you, it paralyzed me. It was the most selfish, stupid fear, and I am so sorry. He reached out, his paint-stained hand hovering near her cheek, not daring to touch her. I love you, Aurora. All of you. The good days and the hard ones. I love you. Aurora looked from his desperate, honest face to the brutal, beautiful confession on the wall, and then back to him. She saw the truth of it, not just in the words, but in the messy, clumsy, magnificent effort of the mural itself. He had stepped into her world, a world of color and emotion, to find a way back to her. She placed her hand over his, guiding his palm to her cheek, leaning into his touch. The warmth of his skin was a balm on her soul. I love you too, she said, the words feeling like a key turning in a long-locked door. And in that moment, standing in the shadow of his grand, desperate gesture, surrounded by the smell of paint and the sound of her own healing heart, they both knew the storm was finally, truly beginning to pass. The confession on the garage wall did not magically erase the hurt, but it did something far more important. It built a bridge back to each other. In the days and weeks that followed, Leo and Aurora learned to walk that bridge with careful, deliberate steps. They talked. They really talked, for hours on end, in her sunlit studio surrounded by the smell of turpentine, or in his penthouse with the city sprawling beneath them. They spoke of their fears with a new, raw honesty. Leo confessed the deep-seated loneliness that had been the backdrop of his life, the emptiness that no amount of success could ever fill, and how the sight of her blood had made that emptiness yawn wide open again, terrifying him with the prospect of losing the one person who had ever made him feel truly seen. Aurora, in turn, shared the daily reality of her condition, the constant low-level anxiety that shadowed even her happiest moments, the doctor's appointments, the days spent curled on the sofa with a heating pad, the profound feeling of being a burden. She let him see the unvarnished truth, and he did not flinch. He listened, he learned, he asked questions. He made her tea when she was in pain, and he simply held her when words were not enough. He learned that love was not just about the grand, passionate gestures, but about the quiet, steadfast presence in the unglamorous moments. Their love story, having weathered its first and most brutal storm, began to deepen and mature in the calm that followed. It was no longer a frantic, dazzling firework, but a steady, warming hearth. Leo's penthouse slowly transformed. A second easel appeared next to Aurora's, where he would sometimes, clumsily but happily, try to paint under her gentle guidance. Her vibrant, textured throw pillows found a home on his austere gray sofas. The refrigerator, once stocked with minimalist, ready-made meals, now held fresh ingredients for the dinners they cooked together, laughing over spilled flour and botched recipes. His world gained color and warmth. Her world gained a foundation of unwavering security. They traveled, not to five-star resorts, but to windswept coasts and misty mountains that Aurora wanted to paint. Leo, who had always traveled for business, discovered the joy of seeing the world through an artist's eyes, of watching her face light up at the way the sunset hit a range of hills. He was her biggest patron, her most ardent supporter, but most importantly, he was her partner. He loved every part of her, not in spite of her struggles, but as an integral part of the strong, beautiful, resilient woman she was. Her bad days did not push him away, they drew him closer, giving him a purpose that felt more meaningful than any business deal ever could. 2 years to the day after he had painted his desperate mural on the garage wall, Leo led a now healthy and glowing Aurora on a walk through the very same botanical gardens he had first taken her to on one of their early dates. It was a place of profound significance for them, a symbol of their new beginning, of growth and nurtured beauty. The air was sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine and damp earth. He led her to a secluded clearing, a spot dappled with sunlight, where a magnificent ancient willow tree wept its graceful branches towards a tranquil pond. It was here, in this perfectly peaceful place, that he stopped. He turned to her, taking both of her hands in his. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady, his gaze clear and full of a love so profound it made her breath catch. He didn't give a grand speech. He simply looked into her summer sky eyes, the eyes he had fallen in love with in a crowded gallery a lifetime ago, and said her name. Aurora. He then slowly, reverently lowered himself to one knee. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. When he opened it, the diamond inside did not catch the light with a flashy blaze, but with a soft, steady, brilliant fire, a perfect mirror of their love. "You are the most beautiful thing that has ever happened to me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are my storm and my sunlight. You are my resurgence. Will you do me the incredible honor of becoming my wife? Will you stay with me for all of our forevers?" Aurora's hands flew to her mouth, but they could not contain the sob of pure, unadulterated joy that escaped her. Tears, but this time only tears of happiness, streamed down her face as she looked from the ring, to his hopeful, loving face and back again. There was not a single moment of hesitation. There was only the absolute, certain knowledge that this was where her life had been leading all along. "Yes," she breathed, the word a whisper and a promise. "Yes, Leo. 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, and as he stood to kiss her, the world around them seemed to sigh with contentment. The kiss was not one of frantic passion, but of a deep, soul-deep sealing of a promise. It was a kiss that spoke of shared storms, of hard-won understanding, and of a future brighter than they had ever dared to imagine. They were no longer just Leo and Aurora, they were a team, a partnership, a love story written in the stars and proven on earth. Their wedding was not a large society event, but a gathering of their closest friends and family in that very same botanical garden. She wore a simple, elegant gown the color of moonlight, and he looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. They wrote their own vows, speaking not of perfection but of promise. A promise to always choose each other, to face the hard days hand in hand, and to never stop building their beautiful, messy, wonderful life together. As they were pronounced husband and wife, the setting sun cast a golden glow identical to the one in the painting that had brought them together, a final, beautiful blessing on their union. Their life was not a fairy tale without challenges, but it was a love story that was real. It was a love built on the solid ground of acceptance, forged in the fire of misunderstanding, and destined to last a lifetime. They had found their forever in each other's arms, a forever that had begun with a stormy painting and was now as bright and enduring as the dawn she was named for. And so, the story of Leo and Aurora, the millionaire and the artist, reaches its happy ending, proving that true love isn't about being perfect, but about being perfectly understood. Their journey may be complete, but countless other stories of heartache, passion, and forever are waiting to be discovered. If you loved following Leo and Aurora's path to love, make sure to subscribe for more unforgettable romance stories. Let us know in the comments which moment of their love story touched your heart the most.